Welcome to the 59th episode of our Crossing Thin Ice podcast series, where twice a month we tackle risk management topics. I'm Max Rudolph, and today Dave Ingram and I will update a podcast about scenarios we released in March of 2025 based on recent events. Things are happening so fast, we need to tell you that we recorded on May 20th, 2025. In some cases, very little has changed, or the time horizon is shortened for a scenario, while in others, the current environment makes us more concerned about a different scenario. In Crossing Thin Ice episode number 54, we discussed scenarios titled Financial, Geopolitical, Cyber, and Public Outrage. Our aim for these offerings, both the podcast and on Substack, is to help with your ERM program and general risk knowledge. We encourage you to share with anyone interested in lifelong learning about risk management, and we welcome your feedback. As a reminder, nothing in today's podcast is intended to be investment advice. We are here to provide educational material on risk topics without getting lost in the weeds. Dave, can you share some thoughts about updating scenarios in general, when it might make sense to do that?
Sure, Max. And I guess we do want to talk about updating scenarios in general because that's something that could come up. Actually, what's expected, though, is that this scenario thing is something that's done annually. I think that's what's cooked into expectations in most companies, and it's also baked into the regulatory expectations. And in fact, the two are very interlinked in many companies where the scenario and stress testing that's done is done for regulatory purposes. We're going to talk about this as if you did have a live scenario process where not only do you do it annually, but you're concerned about using the results of the scenario process. And you're also concerned that if things change a lot, as at least we think that they have in just the last several months, that you might want to consider updating your scenarios and rethinking them. I think that there's a good reason for that update. What you're doing with scenario planning is you're preparing for a number of possible futures. And what that gives you, if you think of a timeline kind of diagram, is it gives you sort of a sideways cone of possibilities that you've anticipated, things that are worse than or better than your expected path for the world. And the size of that cone, the width of that cone has to do with the robustness of your scenario process. And so if you do more scenarios, you probably have a wider cone of things that you've already thought about, already prepared for. Occasionally, something will happen early in the process. In this case, in a couple months, you're suddenly outside of that cone already. When you look forward, you suddenly realize that, well, it looks like there's a number of pretty serious possibilities that are outside of that cone as well. They're not things we anticipated just a couple months ago when we did this. That's, in my mind, the story of why you'd want to update the scenarios. You do have to keep in mind as we're doing this that we're not trying to say that the scenario planning that we ever do tells us exactly what the future is going to be. I can't remember the exact words that Eisenhower used, but he was famous. One of the things he was famous for was saying that plans are useless, but planning is invaluable. And we think that applies to scenario planning especially. As we look at the situation we're in now, I see at least three major things, and Max may have more. The first quarter negative GDP growth wasn't very widely anticipated. And so it wasn't cooked into a lot of people's scenarios for 2025. And all of the machinations over the tariffs and other aspects of geopolitical chaos that have been going on the last couple of months, that was anticipated by few people as well. And then thirdly, I think the resulting stock market volatility. We may be right this minute in a period where the stock market is close to where it was at the beginning of the year. The amount of volatility we had in between and the implications of that volatility for everything that we do and think about are important to consideration. So, all that's why we're here. We're here to examine how this year's scenarios might need to be updated for both our use this year, and also we want to share this as an example of how you would do this kind of updating process, the kind of thinking that you do. So now I'm going to pass it back to Max, and he's going to start us on this process.
Yeah, I'll give some of my thoughts on how conditions have changed and how risk managers and modelers might respond to that. The world is a complex adaptive system with many components interacting in random ways. In many ways, it's like a sand dune with small avalanches releasing pressure or continuing to build up until there's a major collapse. Scenarios should be updated if the assumptions have changed materially, if new information becomes available, or if the starting point needs to be adjusted. A scenario designed for a tail event should not need to be updated frequently. But we're in a period where, as Lenin noted a century ago, there are weeks where decades happen. There are many balls in the air today, and many will need to be caught in order to avoid disruption. I'll review some of our previous scenarios and note where the starting point or modeled assumptions have indeed been moved. In the previous podcast, I had two macroeconomic style scenarios that were designed to identify regime changes. For the financial one, I focused on deglobalization, the high levels of debt, and the growing impact of climate change on the economy. Generally, the environment that led to a challenging scenario is still in place, with debt continuing to grow, extreme events due to climate change more frequent, and deglobalization challenging supply chains for the second time this decade. A major change to a policy of central planning focused on the executive branch of the federal government is now led by essentially a serial user of the bankruptcy code. Congress and the judicial system have at least partially abdicated their duties of oversight. Risky strategies can make sense for individuals and companies, but not for a country with reserve currency status. Consistent application of the rule of law and creative destruction are important components of the American dream. Laws are currently being written that do not allow states to have alternative views in some cases, while situations like abortion find states' rights are deemed most important. There's just not the consistency. Fiscal policy has long meant that free markets were in trouble, but handpicking winners would be hard to recover from economically. Tariff increases and reduced immigration are inflationary and slow economic growth when starting with full employment, so the likelihood of stagflation has risen. Small businesses are especially impacted due to their limited amounts of capital. Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, have already had an impact, destroying from within by closing some government agencies and reducing staffing at others with no regard to actual job duties. This will have long-lasting and higher-order effects, creating uncertainty about information collected and a less safe environment. Tornado outbreaks are occurring with reduced staffing at the National Weather Service and FEMA. Air traffic controllers lose signal with planes, and disinformation is spread about infectious diseases and vaccines. The ancient COBOL code used for Social Security is being replaced, but little time is being spent testing, and staff to assist those who have earned benefits have been cut. IRS audit staff has been cut, even though every dollar spent results in multiple dollars added to the Treasury. USAID was eliminated, impacting negatively our country's reputation and taking away a customer from farmers already hurting from tariff retaliation. This leads to instability and confusion, and eventually a less safe world. It is as if only a few big donors get to decide what is the right solution for everyone else, regardless of their expertise. When Liberation Day was reported, my first thought was that we would soon have trouble keeping shelves stocked in stores. It reminded me of Cuba, where you can tell when imports stopped, because as if time stands still, with cars kept running despite being as old as the Castro regime. Skill sets would need to change in what would be suboptimal ways. In addition, I've recently been learning more about the resource challenges associated with data centers. AI requires large amounts of both electricity and water to answer our queries, making it even harder to meet goals to reduce the risks of climate change. How this will play out in the long run is unknown. Perhaps we're entering a golden age, but the high levels of debt getting higher from the current U.S. tax and budget legislation make this unlikely. Health research is amazing, but catastrophic cuts have been implemented. Proposed cuts to Medicaid will leave millions without health insurance and access to nursing home care, with higher order effects on the nation's healthcare system and quality of life. This time is not different. The midterms of 2026 seem important, possible outcomes ranging across the board for control of Congress, assuming there are no governance issues. My second scenario focused on potential wars. I already expected regional conflicts based on resource shortages like water and aging populations, with piracy increasing on the seas. Climate change means we expect forced migration. So, what has changed? Gaza continues to be described as a genocide. Ukraine has fought Russia to a stalemate if they can continue to access weapons. And Taiwan remains a hotbed of speculation. The U.S. tried to bomb the Houthis into submission and were unsuccessful, the partial ceasefire. Iran is negotiating a nuclear pact again, which could calm tensions in the region. In the meantime, there are concerns about U.S. senior leadership around defense and intelligence, both from the capacity of people in the roles and from some of their actions increasing risks to our troops. The lack of experienced senior leaders is noteworthy, and the war colleges are being dismantled. Groups designed to counter cyber attacks by adversaries have been disbanded. It seems hard to imagine that the U.S. could successfully deploy troops in multiple theaters simultaneously. While this scenario's time horizon may have shortened, it does not need to be updated. Rule of law is also under threat, with immigrants providing a testing ground for arguments that generate precedents for taking away personal and property rights. In less than 3 months, the U.S. has gone from the strongest economy in the world, clearly the dominant military power, to one who claims it is necessary to defer to El Salvador and attacks the science that made us the world's leader. It is now less safe in America and costs more to provide food and shelter. These events and the bond market's response to them has made it more likely that the U.S. reserve currency status is under pressure. For now, it requires an own goal to tear down the benefits from within. But longer term, countries may see opportunity, just like the U.S. did following World War I. This is a new scenario to consider. Two scenarios Dave talked about were a cyber attack and public outrage tied to reputation risk. Dave, is there anything you want to add about their evolution in 2025, or do you have an additional scenario to consider?
Yeah, Max, I think those two scenarios can pretty much stay as is. You, the events of the last couple of months may have changed the likelihood of either or both of those scenarios, but I don't think by enough to warrant any difference in how you'd consider them. But I guess one scenario I want to talk about, you certainly leaned on the idea of recessions to some degree. I think we need to spend some time thinking about our recession scenario, and most companies should have an existing recession protocol that they've used before. It's not like recessions are new, but I think what you need to do is sort of walk yourself through, well, what's possible that'll be very different with this recession than those more recently experienced. Possibilities for what the Fed could do, the same or different. They may be different. Certainly, we saw that in the last major recession that the Fed was suddenly trying to pull out new tricks out of its bag. Can those tricks come out again? Maybe, maybe not. You have to think about that. The labor market is different with different demographic trends. The labor market was due to be tightening a lot. It is tight. And how does that affect a recession? Does labor become a major, or and unemployment become a major factor in a recession, or is that going to be different this time? The amount of private debt, we talk a lot about government debt, but the amount of private debt is through the roof as well. And how is that going to make this recession different than the last several recessions we've been through? Commercial real estate, I'm not sure we've completely worked through the impacts of the changes in employment patterns, the work from home revolution, the decrease in footprint of a lot of businesses that used to take up a lot of office space. I believe there's still unoccupied office space around the country that is very slowly being absorbed. That may be a big factor in a recession. It may be that some of the holders of real estate or the holders of the debt underlying that real estate may suddenly be pressured financially, so that there could be impacts there. And then there's all the international considerations. I don't like drawing analogies to extremes, but you have to wonder about the analogies to the Great Depression when you had trade wars that was considered to be one of the major factors making the Great Depression great. And I don't mean that in a good way. The question of what kind of knobs does the federal government have to adjust for a recession? Question there is, will they turn the knobs the right direction also? I mean, that was another thing, again, looking back to the Great Depression, is that the federal government seemed to turn the knobs in the wrong direction at the start of the Great Depression, which made it deeper and longer lasting. And then you have to look around at different sectors. Max just mentioned things about the tech sector and AI and its energy use. Well, it's also very capital intensive. And so what does a recession do to the availability of capital? If capital availability suddenly dried up, what would that do to the tech sector? And what are the implications of that, both short and long term? So a lot of things to think about in that recession scenario. Max, did you want to say anything before I did the wrap up, or should I just go right into that?
Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about, with some of these additional scenarios. I think it's interesting, and what I would say to modelers is don't rely on the old rules of thumb during these disruptive periods. Go back to first principles when conditions change and make sure your models, will work without just assuming a certain PE ratio will always work or certain interest rates will always happen because they don't. We have these periods of disruption and they occur periodically. Nobody's gonna tell us that it's okay to miss and just keep using the rules of thumb. They're going to expect us to have reasonable models and reasonable results. So good luck with all that. So yeah, why don't you go ahead and wrap us up?
Sure. Well, I would suggest a couple of conclusions from this, and one of them is that I think Max and I both think that scenario planning is even more important in these kind of turbulent times. With that this idea of updating scenarios mid-year, if there are major changes, not every year, but this year certainly could be one of those, that this updating process is useful. And the kind of thinking that we've tried to suggest is the kind of thinking that you want to do when you're doing that update, sort of challenging everything. Because it becomes necessary to review your conclusions that you reached, your expectation of how your plan's going to go, and make sure that you're not heading in a direction that is no longer valid under the current facts. And as you're doing this scenario planning, as you heard Max and I do, try and include at least one imaginative outlier scenario in your process, so that if you think of that sort of cone that I mentioned at the outset there of possibilities, that you've expanded the size of that cone into more areas. My last conclusion out of this is don't throw up your hands in despair and say none of this planning is worthwhile. You won't come up with a plan that's going to predict the future. The fact that you've thought through this makes you a little bit more agile, maybe a lot more agile to be able to adapt to the eventual future.
All right. Well, we hope you have enjoyed this episode of Crossing Thin Ice. If you found it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues.